Welcome to another thrilling episode of Galactic Survival. In today's story, we follow Marya Carsten, a human exchange student, who finds herself trapped on a malfunctioning space station on the brink of destruction, with limited resources and time running out. Marya must fight not only to survive, but to lead a group of diverse alien species through the chaos. The odds are stacked against them, but survival is a choice. Tune in to witness the battle for life, the cost of survival, and the strength of human resilience in the vastness of space. Sirens tore through galactic high without warning, shredding the usual noise of alien chatter into raw panic. Gravity stuttered, then lurched sideways, slamming students into walls as anti-gravity cushions screamed and died. Lights flickered from sterile white to emergency red, while the station groaned like a wounded animal. A distant metallic crack rolled through the structure, followed by the unmistakable hiss of escaping atmosphere. Desks skidded, bodies collided, and oxygen indicators began to blink amber. Professor Vex Noro grasped the edge of his podium as pressure waves rippled across the classroom, his training useless against the chaos. Somewhere beyond the bulkheads, something had gone catastrophically wrong. In the center of the room, Marya Carsten remained on her feet, heart hammering, senses sharp. She tasted metal in the air, felt vibration through her bones, and understood one thing instantly. This was no drill. Survival had begun. There would be no mercy. Oxygen alarms escalated from amber to red as the room depressurized. Thin fog streamed toward a jagged seam in the ceiling, whispering death with every breath stolen. Students clawed for masks that never deployed, their biology failing in different ways at once. Blix's gelatinous mass blistered and sagged under sudden heat loss, while Rhine's leaves curled, chlorophyll draining to gray. Professor Vex Noro shouted commands lost to sirens, his tentacles trembling as meters plunged. Marya moved without orders, sealing a cracked vent with her shoulder, muscles burning as pressure screamed past her ears. Each second thinned the air, turning thoughts heavy, movements sluggish. The station exhaled again, harder, ripping loose papers into the void. Marya forced a slow breath through clenched teeth and counted. Oxygen was bleeding away. Waiting meant suffocation. Action meant pain. She chose action, stepping forward as another warning light died. Around her, the sirens only howled, while others staggered. Marya anchored herself against the shaking floor, knees bent, breath controlled. Earth gravity had taught her how to stay upright when forces tried to break bones. She scanned the room, noting fractures, airflow, panic patterns. Vex Noro struggled to keep students calm, his knowledge dissolving under pressure. Marya shouted, voice cutting through alarms, directing bodies away from the breach. She tore emergency tape, slapped seals where metal screamed, and used her weight like ballast. Pain flared along her ribs, ignored. Her pulse slowed as decisions stacked. Simple and brutal. Move the weak, block the leaks. Buy seconds. Seconds became currency. When the station lurched again, she caught Cathar mid-fall and dragged him clear. Boots skidding. This was the variable no one expected. Not strength alone, not tech, but conditioning under relentless gravity. Marya did not feel heroic. She felt necessary. And the room followed her lead instinctively. Bulkheads slammed down with bone-rattling force, cutting the classroom off from the rest of the station. The impact knocked everyone flat as warning glyphs burned across the walls. Decompression zone. Air stopped flowing. Temperature dropped. Emergency lights cast harsh shadows over bodies pressed together in fear. Vex Noro pounded the sealed hatch, tentacles slick with stress, knowing it would not reopen without external command. Outside, rescue routes collapsed one by one. Inside, the room shrank with every breath taken. Marya tested the bulkhead, listening to vibration, feeling heat bleed from the metal. She counted heads, then oxygen indicators. Numbers were bad, very bad. Students wheezed, physiology clashing with thinning air. Panic clawed at them, contagious and fast. Marya raised her hands, forcing stillness through presence alone. "Stay low, stay close," she signaled, conserving breath. The station creaked again. Sealed in meant time had teeth, and it was already biting hard. Vex Noro accessed the wall console, fingers shaking as emergency protocols scrolled past. Evacuation trees dead-ended in red. Override codes failed. The station AI responded with static and apologies. Procedures assumed intact corridors. Stable gravity. Time. None of those existed anymore. Noro felt centuries of teaching crumble into irrelevance. Around him, species-specific guidance conflicted, each rule endangering another body. Marya watched, then shook her head once. She pointed to the ceiling seams, the pressure map, the oxygen bleed. Protocols would wait for permission that would never arrive. She knelt, tore open a maintenance panel, and rerouted airflow with brute force and tape. The room hissed, then steadied. Noro realized survival required disobedience. Knowledge mattered, but only if adapted. He met Marya's eyes and nodded. Authority shifted without ceremony. When the station shuddered again, no one looked to the console. They looked to the human. Breath slowed, fear narrowed, resolve hardened. Minutes collapsed into heartbeats as the oxygen counter ticked down in ruthless increments. Each inhale scraped the throat. Each exhale felt wasteful. Marya recalculated again, then again, shaving margins until none remained. The station groaned, shedding flakes of insulation like snow. Blicks trembled, mass thinning. Rhinae slumped, leaves brittle. Vex Noro whispered numbers, realizing time had become the predator. Waiting cost air, moving cost strength. Both were finite. Marya mapped a route through maintenance shafts, estimating collapse probability with blunt honesty. 30% survival if they moved now, 0 if they didn't. She signaled the plan with quick gestures, cutting debate short. Fear spiked, then focused. The counter chirped another warning and dimmed. Marya shouldered the hatch, feeling pressure push back. Pain sharpened her thoughts. Time pressed closer, heavy and unseen. When the latch finally gave, the room seemed to inhale as one, then follow into the dark corridor ahead. Beyond the hatch, the maintenance corridor pulsed with warning lights and drifting debris. Inside the classroom, bodies hesitated, clinging to the illusion of safety. Vex Noro weighed options that no longer existed. Hearing the station creak like a timer, some students gestured to stay, to conserve air and pray for rescue. Others glanced at the corridor, seeing only death. Marya met their eyes and shook her head. Waiting was still a choice. She signaled, but it led to suffocation. Moving meant impact, radiation, collapse. She drew a line on the floor with a marker, dividing now from later. "Now," she mouthed, tapping the thinning oxygen gauge. The counter blinked. accusing. Fear argued loudly. Physics argued louder. Marya tightened her gloves, feeling tremor in her hands, then steadied. She stepped through the hatch first, offering her back as proof. The decision snapped into place behind her like a closing door shut. Marya crouched at the corridor junction, fingers tracing vibration through the deck. She calculated force vectors the way she once judged falling rock and floodwater back home. Gravity shifts, metal fatigue, oxygen burn rates. Earth had taught her ruthless arithmetic, bodies versus time. She estimated mass loads for each step, knowing which species could be carried, which had to walk. Radiation spikes pulsed every 40 seconds. Shelter windows lasted 12. She chose angles. Not hope. Vex Noro watched her mouth numbers without sound, realizing this was instinct, sharpened by survival. Not genius. A ceiling panel buckled ahead, shedding sparks. Marya timed the sway, then waved them forward between pulses. Pain flared in her shoulder as she caught a falling student and kept moving. Earth math was never elegant. It only asked one question: what keeps you alive right now? The answer changed every second, and Marya kept up, relentlessly onward. The next hatch refused to yield, warped by heat and pressure. Warning glyphs pulsed as the corridor shook, metal screaming. Marya braced her boots, set her shoulder, and pushed. The seal bit back, tearing fabric, skin, resolve. She reset, breathed once, then slammed again, timing the surge. Something cracked. Air knifed past her face. Vex Noro shouted, "Unheard!" Marya drove her weight forward, muscles burning, bones buzzing. The hatch buckled inward with a shriek, edges glowing. She wedged it open with her body, blood slicking the frame, and waved them through. Radiation washed over her suit in hot needles. She counted steps, not screams. When the last student cleared, Marya rolled aside as the hatch collapsed, sealing darkness behind them. The corridor fell quiet except for her breath, ragged and alive. She stood anyway, wiping blood, already scanning the next threat. Time pressed closer, relentless, unforgiving, demanding motion now always. Metal wailed around them as the station flexed under uneven gravity. The maintenance tunnel twisted, bolts popping free like shrapnel, every vibration echoing through bones. Panels buckled in waves, sending showers of sparks and insulation dust into the air. Marya felt the deck ripple beneath her boots and adjusted her stance, riding the motion instead of fighting it. Vex Noro clung to a rail, eyes wide, reading stress lines blooming across the walls. A deep groan rolled forward, followed by a sharp crack that snapped nerves tight. The structure was speaking, warning in a language of strain and failure. Marya signaled a halt, pressed a palm to the bulkhead, and listened. The rhythm told her where collapse would run next. She moved them single file, spacing weight, urging silence. Another scream tore through the tunnel. This time it came from the metal itself, and it was getting closer fast now. Marya lifted Rhine without ceremony, cradling the plant being against her chest as brittle leaves flaked away. Blix followed, supported by a harness improvised from cables, his form sloshing weakly with each step. The tunnel narrowed, forcing them closer, heat and radiation pressing in. Marya adjusted her pace, absorbing impacts meant for others, her joints screaming in protest, Every stumble threatened catastrophe. She shifted weight, redistributed loads, chose who walked and who was carried. Decisions sharp and final. Vex Noro watched her triage without hesitation, understanding the cruelty required. Survival demanded prioritization. A tremor hit. Throwing them sideways, Marya took the blow, slammed into the wall, then kept moving. Her breath came ragged, vision tunneling, but her grip never loosened. The fragile lived because she bore the cost. Behind them, metal failed in thunderous bursts. Ahead, darkness waited. Marya did not slow. She could not. There was no alternative anymore left. Radiation crept through the corridor in silent waves, invisible but merciless. Sensors chirped warnings as shadows rippled across walls, places where exposure spiked without pattern. Marya felt it as heat under skin, a crawling burn that no armor fully stopped. She angled bodies away from the glow, using her own frame as a shield. Every step deeper etched damage she could not see. Blix whimpered, structure destabilizing. Rhine's leaves blackened at the edges. Vex Noro tracked readings, horror tightening his grip. Marya counted pulses, moved between them, timing passage like crossing sniper fire. A surge hit, slamming her vision white. She stayed upright, teeth clenched, forcing motion. Radiation was not a monster you fought. It was a tax, paid cell by cell. Marya paid first, willingly, knowing delay would cost everyone more. When the counters dipped, she pushed them onward, body screaming, shadows clinging, survival narrowing to endurance alone only. The secondary hub hummed with dying power, lights flickering as the last remnants of life support fought to stabilize. Marya stepped into the room, a heavy breath escaping her as the atmosphere seemed less hostile. Barely. The doors sealed behind them with a soft hiss, and they were momentarily safe, protected by the thin walls of artificial comfort. It wouldn't last long. The air tasted stale, dry against their throats, but it was better than suffocation. Vex Noro dropped to his knees, gasping for breath, his species struggling with the thinning oxygen. Rhine's leaves curled in relief, though barely, as Blix floated beside them, pulse rate slowing. Marya stood guard, eyes darting to the console. It read 15 minutes of remaining air, no rescue signal, no backup, just time. The silence grew louder, stretching the seconds thin. She didn't relax. She didn't dare. They had time. But it was fragile. Marya knelt at the communications panel, fingers trembling as she sent the distress signal once more. Her eyes flickered across the screen. Static. Interference. And then, a brief burst of life. The words "signal received" blinked, then faded into nothing. Her heart sank, the heavy weight of the dead silence around them closing in. She repeated the command, praying for a different result. Another silence, another attempt, this time with manual overrides. Nothing. The station was alone now, lost in space. She stood up, fists clenched, swallowing a bitter lump in her throat. Vex Noro watched her, realization settling in. They were stranded. There would be no rescue, no help coming. It was them against the decaying station. Time had run out. The signal had failed, with no way of reaching the outside world. Marya turned to face the others. The fight for survival wasn't just about the station anymore. It was about their will to survive. The room grew colder as the last breath of life support systems drained away. For a moment, it had felt like safety, a thin thread of hope, but now it was just another lie. Marya paced, her boots echoing against the sterile walls, unable to escape the weight of silence. The secondary hub had promised stability, but the longer they stayed, the more she felt the slow, steady collapse creeping up behind them. Vex Noro slumped against the wall, his tentacles limp, eyes dulled with the crushing realization they were not safe. Blix, once full of vitality, now oozed weakly, its form barely holding together. Rhine had stopped photosynthesizing. Its leaves were beginning to darken. Marya stopped pacing, meeting each of their gazes. There was no more time for comfort, no more space for hope. Survival had become a choice. Who would make it, and at what cost? The lie of safety was over. The oxygen counter flickered, its digital readout sinking into the red. Marya glanced at it once, then again, as if willing it to stop, to hold steady. But it continued its descent. Every breath felt like it took longer, harder than the last. The class was slowing, sweat slicking their skin, eyes wide, staring at the diminishing numbers. Vex Noro struggled to stay conscious, his body unaccustomed to the pressure. Rhine's leaves began to curl inward, wilting under the strain. Blix, a gelatinous blob, quivered on the floor, barely able to form words. Marya's hand shot out, steadying him as he rolled helplessly. There was nothing they could do. The system had failed. The life support system that had been their fragile anchor was no longer enough. They were suffocating, and time was running out. Marya breathed shallowly, ignoring the rising panic inside her. She had no choice. They would have to move. Panic swept through the group like wildfire, uncontrollable and fierce. Vex Noro's tentacles twitched erratically, his breath shallow as his species struggled to process the suffocating air. Blix's gelatinous form rippled, expanding and contracting in distress, unable to keep it together. Rhine's leaves had turned black at the edges, curling tighter, losing vital life. Marya stood at the center, her face tight with concentration, though her heart pounded in her chest. The fear was palpable. She could feel it in her own bones, the rush of panic clawing at her mind, but she couldn't afford it. "Focus," she said, her voice tight but steady. "We need to stay together." Her words barely cut through the chaos as some of the students moved aimlessly, muttering in terror, while others were too weak to stand. Marya's eyes darted to the oxygen tank, barely a quarter full. They were running out of time. The last of the oxygen drained away, the tank's indicator flickering weakly before going dark. Marya felt it in her chest, a tightness that wasn't just from the lack of air, but from the realization. There was no more buffer, no more time. They were done if they didn't act. She moved quickly, her pulse a drumbeat in her ears, eyes scanning for a way out. The door to the next section had to be manually overridden, but the controls were fried, sparking dangerously. Blix was barely coherent. Rhine collapsed into the corner, its leaves darkened with failure. Vex Noro stumbled, clutching his head as his tentacles twitched in distress. The panic was spreading. Fast. "We're out of options," Marya muttered to herself, kneeling next to the control panel. With trembling hands, she yanked wires free, improvising a direct bypass. There was no room for error. One wrong move, and they would be lost. The station groaned, the very fabric of the hull screeching as something shifted violently beneath them. Then, a deafening crash, a hull rupture, not far from their position, tore through the structure with a force that rattled the walls and sent a shockwave of panic through the group. Marya's heart skipped as the lights blinked out, leaving them in total darkness. Save for the flashing emergency beacons, a violent hiss filled the air, signaling the loss of atmosphere. She dove toward the wall, feeling the cold rush of decompression claw at her skin. "Get to the secondary bulkhead!" she shouted, voice hoarse against the rising roar of the breach. Vex Noro staggered, his body too large for the cramped space, while Blix began to convulse in fear. The pressure inside the station shifted, sucking at them like a living thing. With no time left, Marya grabbed Rhine, pushing toward the only escape route they had. Marya's body slammed against the bulkhead as the station's tremors intensified. She heard a sickening crack as her shoulder hit the metal. Pain shot through her arm. But there was no time to stop. Her vision blurred, the cold pressure of the decompression zone squeezing the air from her lungs. Blix floated, limp in her arms, struggling to stay coherent, his gelatinous form leaking bits of itself in a silent scream. Vex Noro screamed a garbled command, but his words were swallowed by the deafening roar of the hull failure. Marya gritted her teeth. Pushing through the pain, she could feel her body giving in. But every step forward was a step closer to survival. Rhine, though barely conscious, still clung to life, its leaves shriveling under the strain. Marya steadied herself, pulling them toward the secondary bulkhead, her broken body the only thing standing between them and the vacuum outside. The deafening roar of the station's collapse faded into an eerie stillness. The last of the hull's pressure shuddered out, leaving nothing but the distant hum of failing systems. Marya's breath was shallow, her ribs aching with every intake of air. The world around her had fallen silent, too silent. She scanned the room, eyes flickering over the group. Blix's form had solidified, its gelatinous body now stiff and still. Vex Noro was slumped, his tentacles twitching in rhythm with his shallow breathing, a pale shadow of his usual self. Rhine's leaves curled inwards, fragile and brittle under the weight of the station's final breaths. Marya stood alone in the quiet, surrounded by the wreckage of their survival. Every part of her body screamed in pain, but it was the silence that crushed her the most. The end was inevitable. She closed her eyes, the weight of everything pressing her into the cold floor. Marya's mind quieted in the stillness. Her body ached beyond the point of awareness. Her pulse slowed, the weight of their survival pressing her down like 100 tons of metal. She could feel the end closing in, but there was no fear left in her. The chaos had stripped it all away, leaving behind a raw understanding. This was it. This was survival's price. She turned her eyes to Blix, to Vex Noro, to Rhine. The truth was, they had done everything they could. There was no more fight to be fought. Acceptance settled over her like a thick blanket. She breathed deeply, the air heavy with the smell of metal and burnt circuits, and let herself feel the peace that came with knowing she had fought until her last ounce of strength. There were no more choices, no more chances. She had given everything, and now it was time to let go. Marya's eyes fluttered open, the haze of exhaustion clouding her thoughts. The stillness pressed on. But now there was a sharp, painful clarity. She could feel the weight of what she had lost. Time, bodies, hope. But most of all, her own strength. Every breath came with a price. The station groaned again, a sound like a dying animal. And in that moment, she knew it wasn't just the hull collapsing. It was everything she had sacrificed to get here. Every choice, every step. Blix's form trembled on the ground, barely holding itself together, while Vex Noro's movements were sluggish, his vitality waning by the minute. Raine's last leaf had turned black, a sign that the energy in the room was gone. They all knew what came next. The silence in her chest mirrored the hollow ache inside. This was the cost of survival, not just the body, but the spirit. Marya's legs felt like stone, heavy and uncooperative, but she pushed herself up anyway. There was no room for hesitation, no luxury of stillness. The price of survival was already paid. It was time to move, to do something, anything, before the stillness overtook them all. She reached out for Blix, her fingers trembling as she lifted him, the weight of his fragile body a constant reminder of the fragile thread they were hanging by. Vex Noro groaned, struggling to push himself upright, his movements slow and labored. Marya steadied him with a firm grip, eyes locked on the distant corridor. Every part of her screamed for rest, for surrender, but she ignored it. They could not wait. Not anymore. With one final, strained breath, she took the first step, then another, each one costing more than the last. Moving was all that mattered now. There was no turning back. Marya's hand gripped the emergency seal lever, the metal cold against her skin, the weight of its importance sinking in. The breach had to be sealed, or they wouldn't last another minute. With shaking hands, she twisted the lever, forcing the mechanism to work against the pressure. Sparks flew, and the groan of the station's dying structure echoed in the chamber. She ignored the pain in her shoulder, the bruises across her body, and focused solely on the task. The seal snapped into place with a deafening click. A rush of air, cool and stale, rushed through the room as the pressure equalized. For a brief, fleeting moment, it felt like safety, but it was only temporary. Marya knew that. She looked over at Vex Noro, at Blix, and at Raine. The battle was far from over. She had sealed them in for now, but the station's countdown continued. Relentless. The silence after the seal was broken only made the system's reboot louder. The hum of failing power systems tried to restart, flickering lights casting long shadows. Marya knelt by the control panel, fingers dancing over the surface, desperately trying to coax life into the dead circuits. The screen blinked, failed, then flickered back to life. Data flooded in. Crash reports, system failures, air quality drops, pressure imbalances. Nothing was working the way it should. She rerouted power, bypassed damaged relays, and patched in auxiliary systems. Slowly, the faintest hum of power returned. Oxygen levels began to stabilize, albeit slowly, and the temperature held steady at freezing. It wasn't enough, but it was a lifeline. Marya exhaled, her breath shaky but relieved. They had moments of air, minutes, maybe hours, but they were alive. Vex Noro was at her side now, watching her work with an unreadable expression. The fight wasn't over, but the spark was back. The station's warning alarm screamed again, louder than before, and Marya's stomach twisted with dread. The temporary stability she had fought so hard for began to crack. The system, barely holding together, began to give way once more. A deep rumble vibrated through the floor, followed by another violent shake. The lights flickered, and for a moment, everything went dark. When they came back on, the damage was evident. Panels buckled and split. Air vents hissed and spat, the structure groaning in protest. Marya staggered, catching herself against the control panel. "No," she whispered. "This wasn't supposed to happen. They had a chance, a small chance, but it was slipping away. She turned to Vex Noro, his tentacles twitching with growing panic. Blix and Rhine still trying to breathe in the dying atmosphere. Marya didn't have answers. Only one thing was certain. They were running out of time. Marya stood in the shadow of the newly rebuilt walls. The once dying station, now a fragile shell of its former self. Engineers had worked tirelessly, patching up the breaches, restoring the bare minimum of systems that allowed them to survive. The walls were stronger now, reinforced, but they carried the scars of their struggle. The air, though breathable, still felt thin, lacking the fullness of what had been lost. Marya's body had healed, but the weight of what they had gone through lingered in every movement, every breath. Vex Noro watched her from the doorway, his tentacles curled in quiet contemplation. Blix, no longer quivering, floated near the new maintenance consoles, testing the stability of the rebuilt systems. Rhine's leaves, though still frail, had regained some color, showing signs of life returning. They had rebuilt the walls, but the true repair had only just begun. Marya looked around at the fragile, restored station, the faces of her companions still marked by the struggle. They had survived, but not without cost. The toll was visible in every line of Vex Noro's weary form, in Blix's quiet trembling, in Rhine's slow, deliberate movements. The station was fixed, but the price of survival was more than she had ever imagined. She felt it in the emptiness inside her, a hollow space where hope had once been, now filled with a quiet resignation. They had done everything to make it out alive, and yet something was missing. The constant ache in her shoulder, the pain of a broken body that still moved with a kind of fierce purpose, was a reminder that survival had its own scars. They had paid a price far heavier than the walls that had been rebuilt. Now, it was time to rebuild themselves. Marya stood at the window, watching as the station's once chaotic surroundings now appeared calm, almost serene. The stars beyond stretched infinitely, a vast reminder of both the vastness of space and the fragility of life within it. Her body still ached, each bruise and fracture a testament to the price they had paid. But in the quiet moments, she felt a strange peace. They had survived, and in surviving, they had learned something essential, not just about strength, but about resilience, about holding on to each other when everything else was falling apart. The station was mended, but it was the people who had been rebuilt, piece by piece, from the inside out. Marya allowed herself a slow breath, eyes lingering on the stars that had watched over them. The cost had been high, but the price of survival had forged a bond stronger than any wall, and that was enough. As the station begins its slow recovery, Marya and her companions find that survival comes at a cost. In the end, it's not just about making it out alive, but about the bonds they forged and the lessons learned in the darkest of moments. Their journey reminds us all that no matter the obstacles, resilience and unity can push us through. Thank you for joining us today. Don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more heart-pounding stories right here on Galactic Survival.